In this video, we'll be talking about some of the basic parts of your code. So I'm in Visual Studio. I have a Hello World program going on and just a little bit else here. I have an integer number that I'm declaring, and it is assigned the value of 5, and then we're writing that out to the console and waiting for the user to press enter. So this program just prints hello world, prints a number, and waits for you to press enter. Now, I can figure that out by going step by step, line by line, from the top to the bottom through this program. But it would be a lot easier if I could just read a description of what it's supposed to do, and that would help to clarify the intent of the programmer. And so one of the great things you can do in code, and that you really must do to get a good grade on a lot of these assignments, is to comment your code. Code comments are statements you can write. They're like statements, but they don't get compiled as code. The compiler just skips right over them, so they don't count as commands to the computer. So you can use them to leave notes, and to document things, and to explain yourself, and to try to describe complicated pieces of code so that whoever's reading it, maybe it's your friend or coworker or your boss or your teacher or your future self, whoever's reading it is able to understand it very quickly instead of having to go line by line. So I've started what's called a single line comment, or a C++ style comment. It starts with a / and a / right next to each other. And then you can type whatever you want here. I'm going to say this program prints hello world and the number 5. Then waits for the enter key. Alright, sounds good. So that's a single line comment, and that can come on its own line. It can also come at the end of a line. So this is a really redundant comment. Declare an integer. So you can put it at the end of line. You can't put it at the beginning of other code, because then it'll comment out the whole line. If you want to do something like that, which you probably shouldn't do, but there's a different kind of comment that can be put almost anywhere in your code. So if you have, say, another place you want to put a comment, or if you want to do a multiple line comment, then you start with /*, and then you end it with */. Now, Visual Studio automatically put in these extra things when I pressed enter, but they're not necessary. So here's a multi-line comment. All right. So that's how you do comments, and they're very important. The other thing I wanted to point out was that I mentioned before that every statement is ended with a semicolon. You can think of semicolons as just separating statements. Some programming languages separate statements by making you write them all out on a single line, and then whatever's on the next line counts as a separate statement. But C# and other C family languages, they don't use white space that way. They use semicolons to separate statements. And that lets you break up your long statements. If you have complicated long statements, you can break them up over multiple lines and stylize it and make it more readable. So it's a good benefit. So semicolons end statements. And you'll notice that most of the lines here end with semicolons. The only ones that don't are like this class definition and this function definition, and that's because they are more like containers. So instead of semicolons, they have curly braces, and the curly braces denote a code block. So this code block is the body of this function, and this code block is the body of this class. And those code blocks have a special property called a scope. And a scope is where variables can live. If you have this int number, this is a variable that's declared in the scope of the main function. And once the main function leaves scope, so once execution goes through hello world, creates this variable, and so on, once it gets to the end curly brace, that integer is gone. It can't be referenced, it can't be used at all in any other code. So you might have other functions or other classes with their own scopes and their own variables inside those scopes. So it's one way to kind of focus your attention on the problem that function or that scope is solving, and what that is supposed to do, and you can kind of ignore what's happening in the other scopes for the most part. Alright, so another thing is that you should follow conventions for naming your variables and your functions and your classes and everything else. Here I have a local variable, just int number. It's local to this function's scope. And I've just used lowercase letters. If this were multiple words to be more informative about it, number of students, say, I would use a style called camel case. So you start off with a lowercase word, and then you capitalize the next word, and then you capitalize the next word until you're done. When you're naming identifiers like variables, you can't put spaces between them, because that would mean it's int number, and then of students makes the compiler kind of unhappy, because that doesn't make any sense to it. So it has to be all together, and you can only use a combination of letters, numbers, and underscores. So the underscore is if you hold shift and press the minus key on the main part of the keyboard, you get an underscore. So let me just get rid of those green squiggles. Alright, so you could have a style like that, but for consistency, try to stick with camel case for variables. For functions, use Pascal case, which is just like camel case, except you capitalize the first letter. So for this class as well, I've used Pascal case. Hello world, two separate words stuck together, and both of them capitalized. Always capitalize the first letter for functions and classes. And then you should pay attention to white space as well. So I've used here, I use 4 spaces for my indentation. So whenever I create a new function, all of the code inside that function is indented by 4 spaces. Sometimes you would have to use tabs to keep in consistency with the style that your company is using, but 4 spaces is very common, very recommended. Alright, so that's most of the basic pieces of the structure that we've seen so far, and we'll get more into writing some more code. See ya.